Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Pastor's Study. Well, actually, today is on the pastor's porch, but I guess that qualifies. You know, there's a lot of anger that's being displayed in our world and in our culture, in our country today. Certainly, some of it is justified. We certainly can't argue that at all. But when people begin to harm other people, when they begin to destroy other people's property, that's when the anger has gotten out of control. And perhaps more importantly, that's when we run head on into a scripture problem. Because scripture is pretty adamant and speaks in several places about anger. And that's really what I want us to look at this morning is to look at what scripture says about anger and perhaps address it in our own lives. Proverbs 29 verse 11 says this: "A fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control." And I think there is the issue of where is the control at. There's no doubt there will be opportunities for us to get angry. There'll be circumstances and situations. In fact, Paul recognizes that. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, he says, "Be angry, but do not sin." And it says, "In your anger, do not sin. And do not let the sun go down on your wrath." Now, that's a whole sermon all by itself, but the reality is that Paul is saying that there will be circumstances, there will be situations in which we will get angry. We see that Jesus got angry when he went into the temple and they were buying and selling, and the money changers were making profits, and all of that was set up in the temple area. And he got angry because they were disrespecting the Father and disobeying Scripture. But Paul's statement to us is that anger is a normal, natural response to circumstances. But even when there's a righteous or a justified opportunity for anger, we're not to allow ourselves to get involved in sin, and we are to deal with the issue. That is, we're not to allow the sun to go down on our wrath and create more problems. He goes on to say in verse 31 of the same chapter, Ephesians chapter 4, that we are to get rid of all bitterness and rage and anger. So Paul is now taking the concept of anger and taking that a step further and going into the concepts of bitterness and rage that flow from uncontrolled anger. Now, when we start thinking about the idea of bitterness, let me read to you from the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, and I'm going to begin with verse 14. Here's what the writer of Hebrews says: "Make every effort to live in peace with all men and to be holy, for without holiness no one will see the Lord." Verse 15. See to it that no one misses the grace of God, and that no bitter root, or the King James calls that root of bitterness, grows up to cause trouble and defile many. In other words, the writer of Hebrews is saying when we allow anger to go beyond the spot of anger, the place of anger, which we were supposed to deal with, and it grows into bitterness, bitterness begins to grow roots into our spirits and cause all sorts of problems, creates all sorts of issues for us. As the writer of Hebrews says, it will defile us. It will defile us in God's presence. Bitterness begins to overtake us. Anger can be dealt with. Bitterness goes deeper. It's a deeper root. It's something that causes us more spiritual problems as well. I was reading in one of my devotionals the other day by Max Lucado, something that I think comes into play here. He writes, "I cannot know what you've been through or how difficult your life has been, but I do know how miserable your life will be if you don't deal with your anger." That's true. We can't control the past, but we can control how we respond to the past. In fact, he goes on to say this: we can't alter yesterday, but we can alter our reactions to yesterday. We cannot change our past, but we can change our response to our past. The reality is this: no matter how hard I try, no matter how much I want to, I cannot change my past. I cannot change the things that have been done to me, the things that have been said about me, and neither can you. But what we can change is how we respond to those issues and those events and those actions in the present, in today, and how we respond to them tomorrow. And I will tell you from personal experience that the longer we allow those anger issues to take root, the longer we refuse or choose not to deal with them, because it is a choice on our part, the more difficult it will be, and the more likely they will grow into things larger than small plants and become large trees that we have to deal with. The roots will no longer be 2 to 3 inches long, but they will be roots that grow much deeper than that. Perhaps the best example I know of is a mimosa tree. If you allow mimosas to begin to grow in your yard, and if you happen to have a big mimosa tree, you will have tiny ones all over your yard. And if you don't root them out immediately when you see them, those roots go so deep that you have to dig 2 and 3 and 4 feet deep to dig up a root for a 1 foot high seedling. They are almost impossible to get out once they take root. Anger, the sooner we get to it, the quicker we pull it out, the quicker we deal with it, the quicker we put it under the blood and confess it, the quicker and easier it is to deal with it. Again, Paul says to deal with it the very day that it comes up. He recognizes that there will be responses of anger within us to circumstances and situations. We are human. We deal with emotions. But the reality is we are to control those, not to allow them to control us. And in Paul's case with anger, he's saying very specifically, don't even let the sun go down on that anger. If we do, we find ourselves in problems and in places that we don't want to find ourselves as Christians. We harm our relationships with each other. We harm our relationships with the Lord. And I have seen people get so angry and so bitter that they literally pulled away from the Lord and from the church because they refuse to deal with those emotions. Frequently they said, well, you don't know what I've been through. No, I don't. But the Father does. And we're told that Jesus was tempted in every way, even as we are. That means he was even tempted to allow anger to get control, to take over and turn into bitterness. Certainly he had plenty of opportunities to do that leading up to and including his time on the cross. He chose not to. In fact, from the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That meant that Jesus had already forgiven them. And I cannot imagine in the midst of that pain and agony choosing to forgive. So let me close with the passage I started with this morning from Proverbs. Proverbs 29:11. A fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control. Are we going to be fools? Or are we going to be wise men? The choice is ours. And that's it today from the pastor's study, or at least from the pastor's porch. I look forward to seeing you again soon. May God's blessings be yours. Goodbye.